Atlas is chained beneath Voidspire. Drills bite into the cracks running across his shell. Across the chamber, Vex hears the machine that ruined his eye. Kieran can feel both companions. He just cannot reach either one. Apex wants more than 3 rejected anomalies. They want Kieran's impossible soulbound. To reach Atlas, Kieran must follow the companion most terrified of going back. Vex has one choice: run from Voidspire, or enter the cage that taught him fear. What he chooses there breaks the rank system. And the answer tells Apex exactly what Project Hollow God has been missing. Rescuing Atlas will save his life and destroy the evolution path he had barely begun to trust. This is today's story. Before we jump in, hit like and subscribe. Now, let's get into the next chapter of Kieran Voss and his rejected raid party. 3 days earlier, the victory at Ashwood already feels complicated. The guild calls Ember an undocumented magma wyvern until anyone finds a better answer. Crownspire's scanners disagree every time. Kieran cares less about rank than Ember's appetite doubling overnight. The evolved beast can finish a crate of ashfish before breakfast. But the power-up came hot. Dr. Elias Ward orders several quiet recovery days before serious combat training. Ember hates it. He stays anyway. For once, nobody is forcing the new body to prove itself. Vex takes the opposite approach to recovery: disappear. Most mornings, the shadow hare sleeps inside the darkest clinic cabinet. Atlas is harder to ignore. His central shell fracture widened in Ashwood and now reaches toward 2 rear plates. Every step clicks. He still places himself between every doorway and the rest of the team. Useful, stubborn, dangerous. Mason Greer warns Atlas that one more heavy block could split the shell farther. Atlas hears him. Atlas disagrees. Kieran taps the good front plate and says hero mode is temporarily disabled. Vex makes a dry clicking sound that feels suspiciously like laughter. For 2 quiet minutes, the room almost resembles a normal raid party recovery. Then a guild clerk arrives with 6 reports and one very nervous face. Ashwood footage went viral overnight. Half the hunter boards call Ember a hidden evolution. The other half call him a system bug. Others freeze frame Kieran's bare wrist and the silver threads around his beasts. The trash tier jokes vanish fast. Someone keeps buying the footage, reposting copies, then erasing the source trail. Rowan Pike names 2 buyers with that kind of budget: governments and syndicates. Kieran asks whether Vareth still bothers separating those on paperwork days. Rowan almost smiles. His eyes do not. Then the guild shows them private requests to inspect Ember. Every offer promises ridiculous money and hides the final buyer. Kieran rejects all of them. Ward calls the decision financially stupid and scientifically correct. Mara Kell arrives from Crownspire with a sealed folder under one arm. She spent 2 nights matching pre-sundering records against the soul thread footage. The match is too close to dismiss now. Those fragments claim voluntary bonds can alter compatible evolution pathways. Modern scholars treated the idea as mythology. Ember just turned mythology into a several hundred-pound medical problem. Mara says the Academy board wants Kieran questioned under formal research authority. Kieran asks whether formal questioning includes cages, restraints, or at least decent snacks. Mara says the first 2 depend on which board member gets control. Kieran declines before she finishes. Mara does not argue. Then she drops the real problem. Apex has gone silent. No stimulant raids, no poaching, no black market core shipments. Rowan hates quiet criminals. Ward calls the silence preparation. Vex's ears flatten when Mara places the recovered silver fang insignia on the table. The reaction lasts less than a second. Kieran still catches it. Chemical fear snaps through the soul thread. Kieran does not touch Vex or ask for memories in front of everyone. He slides the insignia away and lets the hair choose distance. Vex keeps staring from beneath the examination bench. Atlas shifts once, placing his cracked shell between Vex and the silver fang. The fear drops almost immediately. Mara sees it and closes her folder. She leaves Kieran with one warning before returning to Crownspire. If Apex wants the soulbound, they will hit the weakest point first. Kieran hates how many answers that sentence has. The team heads home before sunset, with Rowan escorting them through the lower district. Ember walks beside the wagon now. The old basket is officially useless. Children stop to stare. Ember moves closer to Kieran. Kieran keeps one hand near the new molten tail, without touching the scar. Vex travels through roof shadows and avoids every phone camera below. Atlas rides on reinforced boards because Mason banned long walks today. The tortoise looks personally insulted by transportation that does not require suffering. Rowan calls him an old raid tank with unpaid overtime. Kieran says the description is way too accurate. At the apartment, the front lock is scratched. Nothing is missing. That is worse. The room is exactly as Kieran left it, and Vex hates the perfection immediately. The hair circles twice, nose low, ears tracking different corners. Then he stops beneath the window. A warning pulse reaches Kieran before he sees anything. One clear filament hangs outside the frame like spider silk. Ward identifies a passive resonance sensor used by professional beast trackers. Whoever placed it never crossed the threshold. Rowan cuts the filament and seals it inside an evidence tube. The crystal already holds traces from 3 separate soul thread signatures. Apex is not just following the team. They are profiling each companion separately. Kieran's first instinct is to move everyone immediately. Then he hears Atlas take one clicking step. Ward proposes rotating safe locations while the guild traces the tracker material. Mara offers an unused archive apartment near Voidspire's outer research district. Kieran says that sounds like hiding bait inside a trophy case. Rowan has a less obvious option, and unfortunately, a less comfortable one. Eastwell Forge Clinic treats working beasts without advertising patient lists. Atlas can receive shell stabilization there while Ember finishes recovery. Its underground bays were built for heavy defensive species. Kieran hates splitting the party, but Atlas needs real structural care. Atlas ends the argument by tapping the clinic address with one claw. Treatment accepted. Vex sits beside Atlas and taps the cracked shell once. Nobody comments on it. That is probably why the gesture works. They move before dawn in an unmarked guild supply wagon. Rowan drives. Kieran rides between Atlas and Ember. Vex refuses the wagon until the first bridge, then slips into its shadow. 20 quiet minutes pass. That becomes suspicious. The city is waking, vendors opening shutters beneath pale blue morning fog. Kieran begins thinking Mara's warning may have made everyone slightly paranoid. Then Atlas suddenly raises his head before Vex sends a violent warning pulse. The wagon's rear axle explodes upward without producing any normal fire or smoke. A black resonance field spreads beneath the wheels like ink across glass. Rowan pulls the reins, but the street around them has already gone silent. Pedestrians freeze behind a shimmering barrier they cannot seem to see through. Kieran recognizes the tactic from Ashwood before the first gray mask appears. Apex operatives step from 3 alleys wearing blank cloaks and silver fang insignias. No one shouts, threatens civilians, or wastes time pretending this is random. Their formation is built around capture gear, restraint chains, and portable resonance anchors. Ember growls and lowers his body, molten seams brightening along the neck. Kieran feels his companion asking permission through a sharp pulse of battle intent. He signals restraint because the street is packed with people beyond the barrier. The lead operative smiles. Like that decision confirms exactly what Apex expected. A black anchor slams into the pavement and releases a pulse of deadened sound. Kieran's 3 soul threads flicker at once, then vanish from his awareness. The sudden silence feels worse than pain because the network has never disappeared completely. Vex drops from shadow mid-step and hits the wagon floor in visible panic. Ember's fire gutters along his jaws as if the jammer is choking the core. Atlas moves anyway, dragging his injured body between Kieran and the nearest chain. The first capture cable launches toward Kieran's wrist rather than any beast. Atlas takes the hit across his good front plate before anyone can stop him. The cable unfolds into a lattice of black metal hooks around the shell. Kieran lunges forward, but a second pulse kills the soul thread again. Atlas is pulled backward hard enough to tear the wagon's reinforced boards apart. Rowan throws his spear through one anchor and restores sound for half a heartbeat. That instant is enough for Ember to blast one cable away from Atlas. A second anchor activates before the magma wyvern can fire again. Apex is rotating the jammers like a raid team cycling crowd control perfectly. Kieran realizes they studied Ashwood footage frame by frame before planning this ambush. They know Ember's output, Vex's shadow timing, and Atlas's instinct to block for others. Worst of all, they know Kieran will always protect civilians before chasing damage. The third capture cable targets Ember, but Vex crashes into its trigger mechanism first. Without shadow movement, the hare fights like a normal animal against armored equipment. That should make Vex useless, yet his hearing still tracks every moving component. He kicks the release pin loose before the cable can fully tighten around Ember. Kieran grabs Vex and pulls him away from a collapsing restraint pole. The hare struggles for 1 second, then realizes the hands are helping, not trapping. Atlas slams his weight sideways and breaks one hook against the ruined wagon frame. The effort sends a fresh fracture flashing across the center of his shell. Kieran sees the crack widen and orders Atlas to stop, forcing the escape. No soul thread carries the message, so Kieran has to shout like everyone else. Atlas turns his head, hears him, and still keeps pushing against the restraints. The stubbornness is not obedience anymore. It is the tortoise making his own choice. Rowan reaches a second anchor and smashes its crystal housing with his spear butt. The jammer stutters, returning Kieran's soul threads in one painful burst. Atlas's fear hits first, followed by determination strong enough to overwhelm everything else. Ember's anger burns beside it, while Vex feels like static wrapped around panic. Kieran sends one commandless impulse through the network: stay alive, not win. Ember backs off the nearest operative instead of chasing him into civilian range. Vex slips beneath the wagon again as partial shadow control flickers back online. Atlas finally stops fighting the shell lattice and braces instead of tearing himself apart. The lead operative looks irritated because Kieran's team is not behaving like contracts. He raises one hand, and a hidden fourth anchor activates beneath Atlas directly. Black geometry climbs over the shell, connecting every existing crack with cold light. Atlas freezes as the field turns his damaged plates into one giant resonance target. Ward once warned Kieran that fractures can become separate channels under enough pressure. Apex has apparently reached the same conclusion and weaponized it for capture. The lattice does not pull Atlas physically, it makes the shell vibrate against itself. Pain crashes through the soul thread hard enough to drop Kieran onto one knee. Ember roars and charges despite the civilians, forcing Kieran to redirect him mentally. The magma wyvern slams claws into pavement instead, carving molten trenches beside the operative. That controlled miss buys Rowan time to strike the fourth anchor casing. A gray-masked woman fires a compact bolt before the spear reaches its target. The bolt unfolds into a silver-black curtain between Rowan and the jammer. His spear hits the field and rebounds hard enough to numb both hands. Kieran recognizes the woman from no public file, but everyone else hesitates instantly. Nira Kane steps through the barrier wearing Apex's Silver Fang Command insignia openly. She looks younger than Kieran expected, and far calmer than the streets deserves. Her first words are not a threat. They are Mason Greer's private warning from that morning. One more heavy block could split Atlas's rear plate. Kieran freezes. That sentence was spoken inside a closed clinic room. Nira looks at the new fracture and says Mason was almost right. Then she calls Atlas an unusually promising vessel. Kieran asks how long Apex has been listening to people who never invited them. Nira ignores the question and orders resonance pressure increased by 12%. Kieran feels Atlas's shell scream through the bond before the machine changes pitch. The tortoise collapses onto one front knee, and everyone finally understands what her comm means. Ember's heat spikes, and Vex's healthy eye turns bright violet inside the wagon shadow. Kieran stops trying to preserve the street and signals Ember to break the field. The magma wyvern fires one focused beam directly into the nearest resonance anchor. Molten light tears through the crystal and finally opens a hole in the barrier. Civilians scatter the instant normal sound returns across half the intersection. Rowan starts moving people away while Kieran races toward Atlas's restraints. Vex reaches the tortoise first and bites through a loosened control wire. The lattice flickers, and Atlas forces himself upright with Vex beside his front claw. For 1 second, the raid party is connected again and almost free. Then Nira taps 2 fingers against the silver fang at her collar. A circular void gate opens beneath Atlas without any warning pulse or visible charge. The tortoise drops 6 inches before Kieran catches one front leg with both arms. The pull drags Kieran across broken pavement because Atlas is far too heavy for him to stop. Ember drives both rear claws through the shattered wagon frame, turning the wreck into an anchor. With one fur claw he catches Kieran's coat, while Vex braces against Kieran's sleeve. The chain of bodies still slides toward the gate, but Ember's anchor buys them precious seconds. She says voluntary bonds create stronger stress responses than their models predicted. Kieran screams that Atlas is not another model for Apex to dissect. Nira answers that everything becomes data once survival depends on understanding it. The void gate widens, swallowing half of Atlas's cracked shell below the pavement. Kieran feels the tortoise's fear finally break through the stubborn determination. That fear is not about being taken. Atlas is terrified. Kieran will follow. The soul thread carries one heavy impulse that feels almost like a command. One desperate meaning crosses the fading soul thread from Atlas. Let go. Kieran refuses until Atlas deliberately relaxes the claw he is holding. The movement mirrors Ember choosing the battlefield back inside Ashwa. Atlas is choosing capture to keep the others from being dragged through too. Kieran understands the decision and hates understanding it more than anything. He releases the claw 1 second before the void gate snaps shut completely. Atlas disappears beneath the street, taking one silver soul thread into darkness. The connection stretches impossibly far, burns cold across Kieran's wrist, then vanishes. Ember roars into the empty pavement until nearby windows vibrate from the sound. Vex circles the closed gate twice, digging claws against stone without finding shadow depth. Nira steps backward toward another portal while the remaining operatives cover her exit. Kieran launches himself at her before Rowan can stop. The terrible idea. Nira catches his wrist with the restraint loop, but does not activate it immediately. She studies the bare skin where a normal contract mark should be glowing. Then she quietly tells him Atlas will stay alive while the data stays useful. Kieran says that sentence is the worst reassurance anyone has ever attempted. Nira almost smiles and releases the loop as Ember charges from behind him. Her portal closes around the Apex team before the magma wyvern reaches striking distance. The last thing Kieran sees is the silver fang disappearing into black light. The street returns to normal sound with one companion missing from the formation. Guild patrols arrive minutes later, far too late to help and perfectly timed for paperwork. Kieran answers exactly 3 questions before Rowan tells everyone else to back off. The destroyed wagon becomes an evidence scene filled with broken resonance hardware. Ward reaches the intersection carrying enough medical equipment for a small disaster. He checks Ember first because the jammer left the new core dangerously unstable. Mason arrives behind him and treats Vex's bruised hind leg without forcing restraint. Kieran refuses examination until someone confirms whether Atlas's soul thread still exists. Ward places the tuning crystal against Kieran's wrist and waits for a response. For several seconds, the crystal stays silent, except for Ember and Vex nearby. Then a third note appears, so faintly everyone has to stop breathing. The crystal confirms one vital fact everyone needs: Atlas is alive. The connection is distant, distorted, and buried under something that suppresses resonance. Kieran closes his eyes and follows the note until it turns into painful static. No memory comes through, but one emotion reaches him clearly enough. Atlas is awake, and he knows Kieran survived the ambush. Relief hits Kieran first, followed by rage, so clean it becomes useful. Rowan recognizes the expression and tells him not to raid Apex alone tonight. Kieran says he was planning something much worse, which earns no laughs. Mara arrives from Crownspire before sunset after hearing the attack reached public streets. She takes one look at the void residue and immediately sends students away. The portal technology matches fragments from pre-sundering transit experiments banned after catastrophic failures. Only a handful of facilities were ever built around that kind of architecture. Ward asks how many of those facilities still exist beneath the eastern ruins. Mara answers 1, and Vex stops breathing normally at the word eastern. Kieran notices before anyone else, because the soul thread spikes with old fear. Mara names the abandoned fortress carved beneath those ruins: Voidspire Citadel. Vex bolts across the clinic room and disappears under the darkest storage shelf. The reaction is stronger than anything the Silver Fang insignia caused before. Kieran kneels several feet away and refuses to reach beneath the shelf. He tells Vex nobody will drag him into a memory he does not choose. The hair stays hidden long enough for the room to grow silent. Eventually, one violet eye appears from darkness, fixed on Mara's map instead of Kieran. The old citadel sits east of Vareth beneath collapsed observatories and mining tunnels. Official records say the site became uninhabitable after the sundering damaged its shadow channels. Unofficial reports describe lights, supply caravans, and missing beasts near the ruins recently. Rowan says that sounds less abandoned and more aggressively not public. Mara warns Voidspire once contained experimental transit halls called the Shadow Labyrinth. The labyrinth used artificial darkness to move people between sealed parts of the fortress. After the sundering, those passages started shifting unpredictably around living soul signatures. Most rescue teams entering the lower levels never returned through the same corridor. Kieran asks whether Apex would choose a safer base if they had basic survival instincts. Ward says criminals building illegal evolution labs rarely prioritize reasonable architecture. Vex emerges from hiding and walks directly onto the map without looking around. His front paw lands over Voidspire's eastern access tunnels and stays there. Kieran feels fear through the bond, but something else sits underneath it now. Beneath the fear sits one unmistakable feeling, ignition of this place. Vex has been inside Voidspire before, long before Crownspire found him. No full memory opens, because Kieran refuses to initiate contact without permission. Instead, he places his hand beside the map and waits like Ember's first cage. Vex watches the hand, then presses his nose against Kieran's knuckles voluntarily. The clinic disappears beneath a flash of white lights and metal restraint frames. Kieran sees only 3 seconds before the memory snaps shut violently. A younger Vex is strapped beneath a lens aimed at the clouded eye. A gray mask adjusts the machine while silver fang symbols cover the walls. The memory ends with Vex screaming and darkness swallowing the room completely. Kieran jerks backward, but this time Vex does not run from the contact. The hair is shaking so hard his ears cannot stay upright. Kieran feels no explanation, only the certainty that Voidspire caused the damaged eye. Mara goes pale when he describes the room and the lens apparatus. Crownspire's intake file claimed Vex was found wild near the eastern ruins. That statement was technically true, but apparently missing the entire nightmare before it. Vex must have escaped Voidspire before survey teams found him attacking their drone. Ward says shifting core signatures now make considerably more disturbing sense. Apex did not discover Vex after Crownspire rejected him. The truth lands cleanly now. Apex had Vex before Crownspire ever did. The discovery changes the rescue plan from dangerous to personal for everyone involved. Kieran wants to leave immediately, but Ward blocks the door with surprising authority. Ember's core is still unstable from the jammer, and Vex can barely stand calmly. Charging Voidspire now would turn Atlas's sacrifice into the world's dumbest rescue attempt. Kieran hates the logic, because the logic is obviously correct. Rowan spreads Mara's map flat and gives the Raid 1 rule. Nobody improvises a heroic death. They need one route in, one route out, and one extraction signal. Mara finds a forgotten drainage shaft entering Voidspire from the Western Foundation. It bypasses the obvious surface patrols. It is also too narrow for Ember. The room goes quiet. Before anyone says what that means, Ember's magma seems brighten, and Kieran feels the refusal before the Wyvern moves. Kieran wants him underground too, but Ember's core is still unstable. After the street jammer, another full suppression hit could crash the new form. Kieran kneels and asks Ember to hold the extraction route instead of forcing the choice. Ember presses his snout against Kieran's hands, frustrated enough to heat the air. Across the map, Vex's ears flatten at the outline of Voidspire. Ember notices. The Wyvern lowers himself beside the hare without touching him. For several seconds, neither companion moves. Then Vex places one paw against Ember's scorched fur claw. Fear crosses the soul thread beside a slow pulse of steady heat. Kieran realizes Ember is giving Vex the backup he cannot physically carry inside. That decides the split better than any tactical argument. Rowan, Ember, Mason, and Lena will hold the surface extraction route. Kieran and Vex will take the western shaft alone. Mara marks only the entry and exit because the lower maps contradict each other. Ward modifies the tuning crystal to pulse whenever Atlas's distant thread strengthens. The third note is faint, but it is still there. Vex may read the resonance better than the device once they enter the labyrinth. If another jammer activates, Vex chooses whether they continue. Kieran agrees without adding a loophole. If Atlas's signal fades, they stop and think instead of sprinting into bait. That agreement hurts more, because Atlas is already running out of time. Mara points once toward a blank section near Voidspire Center. Vex starts trembling before her finger reaches it. Kieran folds the map immediately. They do not need to solve all of Voidspire tonight. They need Atlas. Vex keeps one paw on the folded map, and does not move away. They leave after midnight under rain thick enough to blur city surveillance cameras. Kieran wears ordinary courier gear over his field clothes, and keeps his hood low. Vex travels inside his coat for the first mile, avoiding exposed shadow crossings deliberately. The hare has never chosen to stay that physically close during normal travel before. Kieran pretends not to notice because naming trust too loudly can make it fragile. Rowan's wagon carries them east until the paved road becomes broken industrial stone. Ember walks beside the rear axle, heat steaming rain away before droplets touch scales. At the final safe bridge, Kieran climbs down while the surface team continues forward. They will circle north and wait near the ruins beyond Voidspire's known patrol radius. If Kieran sends 2 short soul pulses through Ember, Rowan begins extraction immediately. If no pulse arrives by dawn, Rowan enters anyway, despite every sensible instruction. Kieran says that sounds less like backup and more like scheduled disobedience. Rowan says he learned from watching Kieran, which ends the argument instantly. Ember lowers his head until Kieran can touch the scar anchoring the molten tail. Ember sends one steady emotional meaning through the bond before stepping back. Come back safely. Vex waits a few steps ahead, pretending not to watch the goodbye. Kieran cannot hear words, but the meaning lands with painful clarity. He promises nothing dramatic and simply tells Ember the whole team comes home. Vex jumps from Kieran's coat and starts east without waiting for another goodbye. The shadow hare clearly prefers dangerous ruins over public emotional moments. Rain follows them across 2 miles of blackened fields surrounding the eastern ruins. Broken observatory towers rise ahead like ribs from a buried mechanical beast. No guild lights, patrol banners, or legal salvage markers appear anywhere nearby. That absence confirms Voidspire is active before Kieran sees the first hidden guard. Vex stops beneath the collapsed wall and angles one ear toward empty darkness. Kieran follows the hare's attention until a gray cloak shifts behind cracked stone. The guard is almost invisible beneath rain, camouflage, and a suppression charm. Vex detected the heartbeat before any visual clue existed, exactly as Ward suspected. Kieran waits instead of rushing, letting Vex choose the safest timing for movement. A minute later, the guard turns toward a distant signal light on the ridge. Vex slips through the man's shadow and reappears beside the drainage trench silently. Kieran crosses while the guard remains focused away from him. That clean move feels like the first successful skill check of the entire raid. The western maintenance entrance sits beneath rusted grates, half buried in mud. Mara's map shows a manual release, but the lever snapped decades ago. Kieran starts reaching for tools before Vex disappears through the grate itself. The hare returns moments later with the corroded locking pin between his teeth. Kieran whispers that having a shadow thief in the party is becoming unfair. Vex drops the pin on his boot like payment should have been obvious already. The grate opens just wide enough for Kieran to slide through sideways. Inside, the drainage shaft smells like wet iron, old stone, and something medicinal. Vex freezes at the chemical scent before taking another step into darkness. Kieran feels old panic rise through the thread, but does not push forward. He sits against the wall while rainwater runs around both boots toward the tunnel. Vex watches him, ears low, clearly confused by the complete lack of urgency. Kieran says Atlas needs them alive more than he needs them fast and broken. The hare remains still for almost a minute, breathing hard through the memory trigger. Then Vex steps past Kieran and enters the maintenance shaft by choice. That decision means more than any command, because the tunnel leads directly backward. Kieran follows 3 paces behind, matching the distance Vex seems comfortable maintaining. The shaft slopes downward beneath layers of pre-sundering stone and newer steel repairs. Someone has restored power cables recently, hiding them behind fake corrosion and dust. Apex has been rebuilding Voidspire while leaving the ruins above deliberately dead. Far below, machinery hums with a rhythm too steady for abandoned infrastructure. The tuning crystal inside Kieran's coat answers with one faint metallic note. Atlas's soul thread becomes stronger for 3 seconds, then vanishes beneath static again. Kieran stops and presses 2 fingers against the crystal until his pulse slows. Vex looks back, catches the expression, and touches one paw against Kieran's boot. The contact sends no memory, only a small certainty that Atlas is still ahead. They continue downward until the maintenance shaft opens behind a broken ventilation wall. Beyond it stretches a corridor lit by low strips of cold violet light. Gray-masked technicians push sealed carts past doors marked only with serial symbols. Most carts contain crystals, restraints, or dark cylinders pulsing like stored essence. One cage passes with a sleeping beast inside, its contract collar wrapped in wires. Kieran's jaw tightens, but Vex blocks his path with one small body. The hare knows exactly what reckless rescue energy looks like after traveling with him. Kieran waits until the patrol turns and slips behind the final cart instead. Their goal is Atlas first, then everyone else if an exit becomes possible. That priority tastes terrible, but trying to free the fortress now guarantees a wipe. Vex leads them through a service door before the next camera completes rotation. Inside, old stone replaces new Apex plating, and the air grows noticeably colder. The corridor walls carry faded diagrams of overlapping circles and human silhouettes. Mara's map identifies this section as the outer edge of the Shadow Labyrinth. Kieran expected darkness, traps, and maybe dramatic architecture from the name. Instead, the entrance looks like an ordinary hallway with 3 identical doors. Vex refuses all 3 and stares at the wall between the second and third. The healthy eye glows violet, while the damaged eye remains completely clouded. Kieran feels a pulse of direction through their bond, before seeing any opening. Vex steps into the blank wall and disappears as if the stone never existed. Kieran reaches toward the surface, then stops before touching it blindly. The hair's soul thread pulls once, inviting rather than commanding him forward. Kieran trusts the signal and walks directly through solid stone without testing first. Cold darkness closes around him for one impossible second before the floor returns. He emerges inside a circular chamber with no visible entrance behind him. Vex waits at the center, looking annoyingly unsurprised that reality just cheated. Kieran says the Academy definitely skipped the useful chapters of ancient architecture. The tuning crystal rings twice, louder than anywhere above the labyrinth entrance. Atlas is somewhere deeper, but the path now exists outside normal physical space. The chamber contains 6 corridors, even though Mara's map shows only 4. Each passage carries the same violet lights, identical floor marks, and identical echoes. Kieran realizes the labyrinth is not hiding directions. It is manufacturing convincing wrong ones. Vex closes the healthy eye and listens, instead of choosing by sight. For several seconds, the hair stands completely still inside the impossible crossroads. Then both ears turn toward a corridor Kieran could swear appeared last. Kieran asks whether that is the correct path, and immediately regrets the wording. Vex opens one eye and gives him a look suggesting correct is overly ambitious. They take the corridor anyway, because trust is the only map still updating. After 20 steps, the hallway folds upward without changing the direction of gravity. Kieran looks back and sees the previous chamber hanging vertically behind them. His stomach complains before his brain accepts the geometry as somebody else's problem. Vex moves normally because shadow creatures apparently consider physics a polite suggestion. The first security pulse reaches them halfway across the tilted corridor. Violet light sweeps from floor to ceiling, searching for registered contract marks. Kieran's wrist stays dark because his soul bond still creates no ownership seal. The scanner passes over him and displays nothing, exactly like Voidspire's failed tests. For once, zero bond is not an insult, but a perfect stealth build. Vex crosses behind him before the scanner can analyze the unstable shadow core. They reach another chamber without triggering alarms, which feels suspiciously generous. The tuning crystal points left, but Vex stops and refuses that route completely. Kieran checks the soul thread and feels fear layered over strong warning intent. The crystal hears Atlas directly. Vex is sensing something dangerous between them. Kieran chooses Vex over the device without asking for an explanation first. They take the longer right corridor, moving away from Atlas's signal temporarily. 10 seconds later, the left passage erupts with a white containment field behind them. Apex guards pour into the empty trap, clearly expecting someone to follow. Resonance bait. Kieran does not celebrate because the realization underneath that trap is worse. Apex knows someone connected to Atlas might come looking through the labyrinth. The ambush on the street was not only capture, it was also an invitation. Nero wants Kieran inside Voidspire badly enough to leave a trail he can follow. Vex looks back toward the trap, and the same conclusion passes through both of them. They are not infiltrating a fortress that failed to notice them. They are walking deeper into a test built specifically for their bond. Kieran lowers his voice, even though no guard is currently close enough to hear. He tells Vex they can still leave and rebuild another rescue route entirely. The hair does not turn around, but one ear angles backward toward him. Kieran adds that Atlas chose capture to keep them safe, not reckless afterward. Vex's tail twitches once, then the hair continues deeper at a slower pace. The answer is not courage exactly. It looks more like fear moving. Anyway, their next corridor opens above a vast chamber divided by transparent black floors. Below them, dozens of shadow channels intersect like veins beneath frozen glass. Each channel carries distorted silhouettes that move faster than normal walking speed. Kieran realizes the Shadow Labyrinth was once a transit network, not merely security. Apex has restored pieces of it using modern resonance engines bolted onto ancient stone. The combination feels wrong, like a racing engine welded inside a ruined cathedral. Vex crouches when one restored channel activates beneath their feet without warning. For a heartbeat, the floor shows another hallway existing several rooms away. A gray masked handler drags a sedated beast through that distant passage by chains. The image vanishes before Kieran can identify the creature or destination. Vex's healthy eye follows the fading shadow with immediate predatory focus. Kieran feels anger through the bond, but no panic comes with it this time. The hare is learning that returning here does not mean becoming helpless again. They descend a maintenance ladder into the glass chamber while patrol lights cycle overhead. Vex chooses each foothold before Kieran moves, reading vibrations through the metal supports. Halfway down, the tuning crystal pulses so strongly Kieran nearly drops it. Atlas's thread is close enough now to carry a faint physical sensation. Pressure grinds across Kieran's shoulders even though nothing touches him there. He recognizes the mirrored pain as Atlas's shell being compressed somewhere below. The tortoise is awake during whatever Apex is doing, which destroys Kieran's remaining patience. Vex blocks the ladder with both hind feet before Kieran can jump recklessly downward. The hare stares until Kieran breathes normally and keeps both hands on the rungs. That silent correction saves them when two technicians enter the chamber beneath them. One complains that subject Atlas keeps rejecting artificial resonance alignment under pressure. The other says fractured shells should accept multiple channels better than intact ones. Kieran's grip tightens hard enough to make the old ladder creak dangerously. Vex presses one paw over his fingers until the sound stops. The technicians mention moving Atlas to Vessel Lab 4 before final extraction tests. They also mention Nira personally ordered the tortoise kept alive and conscious. The phrase conscious is treated like a useful laboratory condition, not basic mercy. Kieran stores every word because rage will matter later if information survives now. The technicians leave through a service gate marked with 4 vertical black lines. Mara's map has no Vessel Lab 4 anywhere on the surviving research level. Vex immediately follows their scent trail instead of the tuning crystal's direct pull. That decision leads through a corridor filled with discarded control collars and cracked lenses. The first lens makes Vex stop so suddenly Kieran nearly steps over him. It resembles the device from Vex's memory, only smaller and newer. A thin metal frame still carries dried black residue around the eye mount. Kieran says they do not need to investigate it and starts moving around. Vex remains beside the lens, staring with the damaged eye instead of the healthy one. Then the hare nudges it over with one paw and watches the glass break. The action sends a wave of relief through the soul thread sharper than expected. Kieran realizes Vex has probably imagined breaking that machine for years. He lets the pieces remain on the floor and follows without cleaning evidence. The next room contains storage records printed on physical strips instead of network terminals. Apex apparently expects digital intrusion more than someone crawling through ancient maintenance shafts. Kieran scans the labels while Vex watches both doors for movement. Most strips list anonymous subject codes, treatment cycles, and something called phase tolerance. One drawer carries a faded label beginning with VN7. Vex freezes before Kieran even touches the handle. The first intake image shows a younger, charcoal-furred hare with both eyes perfectly clear. Kieran barely recognizes the animal beside him. Vex steps backward, ears pressed flat. Kieran stops turning pages. After several seconds, Vex returns and places one paw on the next sheet. Kieran waits until the paw nudges forward. The second image shows a metal ring locked around the left eye. Kieran's anger spikes, but he keeps his hand still. Vex touches the clouded eye, then touches the photograph. The meaning lands harder than any label. Apex did this. Kieran reads the notes only after Vex allows him to continue. They describe repeated forced crossings through artificial shadow gates. The procedure was meant to amplify a soul sense Vex already possessed. The final attempt destroyed ordinary sight in the left eye. Instead, Apex did not create Vex's gift. They damaged him trying to own it. The escape page records a blackout, one handler's shadow, and a route east. Kieran pockets the evidence only after Vex taps the pages once. Vex closes the drawer himself and turns back toward Atlas's signal. The past is documented now, but Atlas is still being hurt somewhere ahead. They leave the archive room as distant alarms begin pulsing through the labyrinth. No siren mentions intruders. Instead, the announcement calls for vessel for stabilization. Kieran's tuning crystal vibrates hard enough to ring against his ribs. Atlas's soul thread returns with a brutal pulse of pain and defensive instinct. For 1 second, Kieran sees no memory, only a sensory flash of crushing weight. Vex bolts down the corridor before Kieran gives any signal at all. They They reach a junction where 3 security doors close simultaneously around them. The only remaining path is a narrow shadow channel pulsing beneath the floor. Vex enters first, but Kieran's body hits invisible resistance at the threshold. The ancient transit system recognizes Vex's shadow affinity and rejects Kieran completely. Kieran tries stepping through twice before the channel throws him backward into stone. Vex reappears beside him and circles the threshold with rising frustration. The route beyond leads toward Atlas, and no physical hallway remains open anymore. Kieran considers waiting for another door cycle until the distant pain spikes again. Then Vex presses both front paws against Kieran's chest and closes his healthy eye. The soul thread tightens, not like a command, but like the hair asking permission. Kieran places one hand lightly against Vex's shoulder and lets the connection deepen. Darkness floods his senses without opening any memory this time. Instead, he feels Vex mapping living signatures beyond walls as points of pressure. Atlas burns ahead like a heavy silver note surrounded by dozens of hostile pulses. Kieran also senses a thinner route of shadow between himself and the transit channel. Vex steps backward into darkness while maintaining contact through the soul thread. The shadow stretches around Kieran's boots, climbs his coat, and erases the floor. For one terrifying second, he feels weightless without knowing whether breathing still matters. Then both of them fall onto stone inside another corridor 30 yards away. Vex collapses immediately, panting hard, with violet light flickering around the healthy eye. Kieran realizes the hair just pulled a human through shadow without a contract seal. That should be impossible for an F-rank core, and it nearly empties Vex anyway. Kieran refuses to move until the hair's breathing steadies, despite Atlas's distant pain. Vex growls weakly, clearly considering the medical delay deeply offensive raid management. Kieran says collapsing before the boss room is also poor raid management. The hair's ears rise slightly, which counts as losing the argument in Kieran's mind. They continue only after Vex can walk without dragging one hind leg. The corridor ends above a laboratory visible through reinforced observation glass. Atlas lies at the exact center, beneath an articulated restraint frame larger than his body. Black braces lock every shell plate, while separate cables feed each fracture. The damaged center has been opened wider, exposing dark metallic tissue beneath the armor. Kieran has to force himself to look beyond Atlas and read the room. The observation door sits below him on the near wall, 12 yards from the restraint frame. 2 clear lanes run toward Atlas, broken only by steel worktables and mobile consoles. Nira stands on a raised control platform at the rear right corner. At the rear left, a black crystalline core floats inside a transparent containment column. The core holds several colors, moving like trapped storms under glass. Vex recoils from the column before Kieran understands why. Technicians circle Atlas between the center frame and Nira's platform. The whole lab is arranged like a boss room built around one suffering creature. Kieran cannot identify the object, but the soul thread recoils from it instinctively. Vex reacts even harder, fur lifting as though the column smells like death. A technician reports Atlas lacks sufficient compatibility for composite resonance integration. Nira says compatibility is irrelevant because the shell architecture is the useful variable. They are not trying to evolve Atlas at all. They are using him as structural research. The thought is almost worse because his future never mattered inside their experiment. Another technician asks whether they should increase pressure until the channels merge forcibly. Nira says not yet, because Kieran Voss has not reached the observation level. Kieran goes completely still behind the glass when he hears his own name. Vex looks at him, and both understand. The trap has reached its intended room. Nira turns toward the observation window, even though the glass should be one way. She cannot see Kieran directly, but her smile says she knows enough. Speakers activate above the corridor and carry her voice without any alarm tone. Nira welcomes Kieran to Voidspire like he arrived for a scheduled research appointment. Kieran asks whether kidnapping companions is standard Apex hospitality or premium service. Nira says Atlas is alive because she expected Kieran to make that joke eventually. The casual answer proves she studied more than battle footage before planning this. Nira says every choice inside the labyrinth has been recorded. When Vex chose a route, Apex measured, Kieran following without commands. When Kieran ignored stronger resonance bait, they measured trust-beating signal strength. Even the shadow crossing became a data point the fortress had never captured before. Kieran realizes Voidspire itself is the experiment. Nira gives him only one principle: contracts move commands one way. His bond does not. Then she stops explaining. Kieran asks what they built that needs the difference. Nira looks toward the black crystalline core. Project Hollow God. The core answers the name with one heavy pulse. Every captive beast nearby screams at once. Dozens of unrelated soul signatures scrape across Kieran's senses. Vex recoils as if several creatures are occupying the same space. Kieran sees 3 familiar data streams feeding the containment model. One maps Atlas's separated fracture channels. One mirrors Vex's phase movement through unstable shadow. A third replays Ember's Ashheart activation timing. Nira says nothing. Kieran finishes the equation himself. Apex is testing how separate traits can coexist, move, and awaken inside one vessel. Every graph still crashes when those channels try to synchronize. Kieran looks at his own silver threads and understands why Nira wanted him inside the room. Kieran slams both hands against the observation glass before he can stop himself. Atlas lifts his head at the sound, and the distant soul thread surges suddenly. The tortoise recognizes Kieran through 3 walls and a resonance suppression field. Relief crosses the bond so strongly, Kieran almost mistakes it for physical warmth. Then Atlas stops fighting the braces. He goes completely still beneath the frame. The soul thread carries no surrender, only timing. Atlas is waiting for Kieran. For once, he is not trying to sacrifice himself alone. Kieran lowers his hands and forces anger back into something shaped like strategy. Breaking the glass now would trigger every defense before Atlas can even move. Vex circles the corridor, searching for an access route the obvious door does not provide. The hare finds a ventilation shadow barely wide enough to hide one front paw. Kieran points toward Atlas, then toward the vent, asking rather than ordering silently. Vex studies the route and sends back one sharp pulse of refusal. The shaft smells of the same chemicals tied to his old restraints. Kieran accepts the answer immediately and starts checking the security door instead. That choice surprises Vex enough to interrupt the panic climbing through their thread. Kieran says one rescue does not require sacrificing another companion to old trauma. The hare stares at him for several seconds, then looks back at the vent. Vex touches the opening again, voluntarily, but keeps one paw anchored outside. This time, the soul thread carries control because the decision belongs to him. Kieran kneels beside the vent and promises to pull him out at the first signal. Vex slips inside slowly, body flattening into shadow without disappearing completely. Kieran feels every heartbeat through the bond while the hare crosses the narrow shaft. The chemical scent intensifies, followed by a flash of old memory pressure. White lamps, restraints, and a metal lens flicker across Kieran's mind without full context. Vex pauses inside the shaft as panic pushes his soul sense toward static. Kieran sends no instruction, only the emotional echo of patience learned beside Ember's cage. No scene or memory crosses the bond, only patience, safety, and open space. Vex's breathing slows enough for the thread to stop vibrating against Kieran's wrist. The hare continues and reaches a maintenance recess behind the laboratory wall. From there, Vex can see Atlas's restraint frame without entering the open room. Kieran receives impressions of cables, guards, and one shadow beneath Nira's platform. He maps the positions mentally while pretending to study the visible door controls. Nira keeps talking because silence apparently feels inefficient to Apex leadership. She asks why Kieran refuses a conventional contract when his companions already obey. Kieran says cooperation and ownership only look identical from very far away. Nira counters that choice becomes unreliable the moment survival demands immediate action. Kieran glances at Atlas waiting beneath the braces and says she is proving his point. The tortoise could have obeyed fear and torn himself apart during the ambush. Instead, Atlas chose the move that protected the whole team, including Kieran. Nira calls sacrifice another form of predictable behavior under correct emotional pressure. Kieran realizes she understands patterns, but keeps mistaking understanding for permission. That flaw may be the only blind spot. Apex cannot model with machines. He sends Vex no command, only the observation that one guard keeps shifting weight. The hare decides what to do with the information and disappears beneath that guard's shadow. A second later, the security panel behind the man goes dark without any visible attack. Kieran kicks the observation door when the magnetic lock loses power unexpectedly. The door opens 3 inches before emergency bolts catch inside the frame. That gap is enough for Kieran to wedge Ward's tuning crystal into the mechanism. The crystal screams under resonance load, but prevents the bolts from fully closing. Kieran forces the gap wider while technicians shout and guards move toward him. Vex reappears inside the lab behind Atlas's restraint frame. The hair bites through the weakest signal cable instead of attacking any person. Atlas's rear braces unlock, but the central shell lattice immediately tightens harder. Pain erupts through the soul thread, followed by Atlas's refusal to panic. Kieran squeezes through the observation door. Atlas is 12 yards ahead at the center of the lab. 2 guards block the direct lane. Nira's control platform sits rear right, the black core rear left. A row of steelwork tables is the only cover between Kieran and Atlas. He flips the nearest table and slides behind it as a restraint chain snaps over his shoulder. Vex exits a floor shadow along the left wall and kicks the nearest control switch. 2 front restraints release from Atlas. The central brace stays locked. Nira remains on the raised rear right platform, watching instead of retreating. She orders both guards to protect Kieran's left hand at any cost. That tells him Apex values the soul bond more than the person carrying it. Kieran crosses the last 6 yards and plants one palm on Atlas's intact front plate. A memory bond tears open through the suppression field before he can brace for it. The street ambush returns from Atlas's viewpoint, the gate, Kieran's grip, then the moment he let go. Relief floods the memory because nobody else fell through after him. Then darkness replaces the street, followed by hours of mechanical pressure. Atlas woke in this same central frame while technicians argued over his fractured channels. Every test tried forcing those separate pathways into one synchronized circuit. Atlas resisted because every merger felt like losing control of his own body. When the pressure rose, he remembered Kieran saying nobody earns points for dying correctly. That memory stopped pain from turning into another automatic sacrifice. Kieran snaps back beside the central frame with no time to process the tears in his eyes. Atlas receives only fragmented emotional echoes back, never Kieran's full memory or history. The echo carries one promise. This rescue does not require Atlas proving anything. Atlas stops, bracing against Kieran's hand. At the frame's rear left, Vex bites through another signal cable. Nira hits a control on the rear right platform. Every lab light dies. Darkness should favor Vex. Instead, the room itself changes. Reflective black glass spreads across the floor, multiplying every shadow. Vex freezes as his soul sense returns too many overlapping signals at once. Nira says this chamber was designed for that exact weakness. Apex learned Vex's navigation limits before he ever escaped Voidspire. Old terror spikes through the soul thread. For Vex, the lab becomes the room that destroyed his eye. Every reflection feels like another gate waiting to punish a wrong step. The left side guard cuts across the open lane toward Kieran. Atlas twists inside the central frame and catches the strike on his front plate. The impact deepens the fracture. Black sparks jump from exposed metallic tissue. A second guard circles the frame from the right. Atlas tries to turn. The central brace locks every shell plate at once. The crack that follows is louder than the alarm. Atlas collapses at the center of the room. The pain hits Kieran through the bond hard enough to blur the entire lab. Nira halts both guards. A destroyed structural model is useless data. Kieran uses the pause to look past Atlas toward Vex near the far wall. The hair is trapped between false shadows, shaking under violet emergency strips. Kieran cannot free Atlas while Vex is trapped inside a room built from his trauma, and ordering Vex through it would make Kieran another handler demanding performance. So he abandons the obvious play. Kieran sits beside Atlas at the center of the lab and stops directing Vex entirely. For the first time, Nira looks confused. Kieran tells Vex he is allowed to leave. Atlas would never want another companion broken for this rescue. Vex looks from the exit wall to Atlas in the central frame. False shadows multiply across the glass floor, carrying echoes of old handlers and machines. Every instinct in Vex screams to get out before the cage closes. Kieran does not argue with that fear. He turns back to Atlas and starts working the manual brace instead. The choice stays completely with Vex. From the rear right platform, Nira calls trust inefficient when every second has measurable cost. Kieran says maybe that is why Apex keeps building monsters that hate them. The left guard advances on Vex, expecting him to retreat toward the far wall. Vex does retreat straight behind a false reflection. The soul thread stretches thin. For one heartbeat, Kieran thinks Vex chose escape. Then the guard's own shadow rises behind him like a doorway. Vex steps out of it with both ears raised and his healthy eye blazing. He did not run away from the fight. He ran around it. One kick sends the guard's restraint controller skidding across the glass. Atlas's central brace flickers, but Nira restores power from her platform. Vex vanishes before the right side guard can turn. This time, the soul thread carries focus instead of panic. The reflections remain, but Vex stops trying to sort them with sight. He closes his healthy eye. The clouded eye faces the room while his soul sense takes over. The injury Apex created becomes the one filter its mirror trap cannot fool. Living signatures sharpen in Kieran's borrowed perception like lights under deep water. Two guards burn hot. Atlas stays steady at center, and Nira feels cold on the rear platform. The false shadows contain no souls. Nira realizes the countermeasure has failed. She orders phase distortion beyond approved stability. The black floor ripples. Shadows detach from their physical sources. Now, even soul sense struggles because space itself is folding between signatures. Vex's core pressure climbs toward the instability Ward warned about. Kieran sends one warning pulse and nothing else. Vex answers with chosen risk, not sacrifice. Kieran knows the difference only because his companions taught him. He asks Vex one final time whether he wants to continue. Vex opens the healthy eye, looks at Atlas, and steps forward. Silver light tightens along the soul thread as violet energy gathers under his paws. Apex sensors start failing across the room. Nira orders every recorder kept live. Kieran shouts that Vex's core is destabilizing. Nira says the response is exactly what she needed. Vex takes one more step. His shadow stops, obeying the room's light. Darkness climbs his body instead of spreading across the floor. The healthy eye burns violet. The damaged eye stays pale and unchanged. The evolution does not heal the injury. It builds around it. Hind legs lengthen, shoulders rise, and the compact hair silhouette stretches into a lean predator. His long ears sharpen, but keep the same unmistakable shape. Charcoal fur separates into layered shadow fibers around the clouded eye and spine. Violet rings snap beneath each paw, then jump toward shadows that are not connected. Vex grows to Kieran's waist and lowers into a stalking stance. Before the transformation fully settles, he steps into one broken patch of darkness. He appears across the lab from a completely disconnected shadow. Nira whispers that forced phase trials never produced anything like this. Kieran says Vex never chose to evolve for Apex. The last false reflections collapse instead of exploding outward. Every shadow snaps back to its real source. Vex stands revealed as a Void Shade Stalker. Ward's tuning crystal cracks from the resonance spike. Nira's nearest guard moves first. Vex vanishes from open floor without using any visible patch of darkness. He emerges from the shadow beneath Nira's own boots. He ignores her body and tears through the console cables. Every restraint frame in Vessel Lab 4 drops out of sync. Atlas pulls one foreleg free. Nira finally steps back. A sharper signal enters Kieran's soul thread. Not words, not memories. Position. Kieran knows which guard Vex will draw away before the stalker moves. Atlas senses it too, and shifts his free plate toward the opening. Three companions coordinate through the soul lattice without one spoken command. Nira stops watching the evolution and starts watching the network. She orders every sensor to prioritize bond data over containment. That scares Kieran more than her surprise. Vex crosses three disconnected shadows in one movement without collapsing. That was impossible before evolution. He appears behind the nearest handler and severs a control chain. The chain dies. The captive beast attached to it stops thrashing. There is the real power-up. Vex can interrupt forced control channels. Against Apex, that is a perfect hard counter. Nira orders manual weapons only and shuts down automated collars around the room. That tactical switch saves her guards from losing every controlled beast at once. Kieran reaches Atlas's final brace while Vex keeps the operatives moving defensively. He cannot lift the shell, but the manual release sits beneath the welded safety plate. Atlas angles his strongest front claw and crushes the plate without hurting the mechanism. Kieran pulls the release lever, and the entire restraint frame unlocks with a violent hiss. Atlas tries standing immediately, but the shell collapses lower than before the experiment. The tortoise's legs work. The damaged armor simply cannot distribute weight correctly anymore. Kieran crouches beside Atlas and refuses to pretend the injury is anything smaller. He tells the tortoise they are leaving slowly, if slow is what the body allows. Atlas leans against Kieran's shoulder, despite weighing enough to make the gesture ridiculous. Vex returns beside them and lowers the new larger body beneath one damaged shell edge. The Void Shade Stalker becomes a living support while Atlas pushes himself upright. For one impossible second, the two rejected F ranks hold each other together inside Voidspire. Kieran feels the emotional echo pass between all three, and almost loses focus again. Nira uses that moment to seal every normal exit from the laboratory remotely. Steel shutters crash over the doors while the Shadow Labyrinth begins another phase shift. Vex looks toward the walls, and the new soul sense tracks pathways Kieran cannot perceive. The Stalker finds one route through the darkness behind the Hollow God containment column. Unfortunately, reaching it means crossing directly beside the Project Apex, built from stolen souls. Kieran hates the route immediately because the containment column feels wrong through every soul thread. The black core inside pulses again, and distant captive beasts answer with synchronized cries. Atlas lowers his head, while Vex's new shadow fibers flatten against his body. Neither companion wants to approach the thing, which confirms Kieran's instincts are not paranoia. The sealed doors leave no alternative before security teams regroup outside the lab. Kieran asks Vex whether the hidden route is stable enough for Atlas's size. The Stalker touches one paw against the floor and sends uncertain pressure through the bond. That answer means maybe, which currently ranks above every other available option. They move behind the containment column while Nira circles toward an emergency control station. Kieran catches a closer look at Hollow God's core and immediately wishes he had not. Dozens of faint beast silhouettes appear inside the black crystal when light shifts. Some are winged, some horned, and others too distorted to identify cleanly. The shapes are not bodies. They look more like impressions trapped in condensed essence. Ward once described a beast core as memory, instinct, and energy compressed together. Apex has apparently harvested pieces of all three and forced them into one container. Kieran feels rage from Ember through the distant soul thread, even miles away. The surface bond has sensed something wrong. Despite the fortress's suppression fields, that means the soul lattice is reaching farther than anyone understood after Ashwood. Nira notices Kieran's expression and says, "Hollow God will end dependency on rare bloodlines. One engineered vessel could carry every useful trait instead of waiting generations for evolution." Kieran asks how many creatures need hollowed cores for that efficient little shortcut. Nira answers with silence, which is somehow more honest than anything else today. Vex finds the hidden shadow seam and steps halfway through to test the route. The passage opens as a vertical crack of darkness behind the containment machinery. Atlas cannot phase naturally, so Vex must widen the channel around his physical body. That same technique nearly emptied Vex while pulling Kieran through one corridor earlier. Kieran refuses until he feels whether the evolved core can handle the load. Now, Vex sends back calm, focus, and a reserve of energy that feels dramatically deeper. Evolution changed more than shape. The shadow pathways no longer fight the hare's body. Kieran still insists on crossing first, so Vex can abort if anything feels wrong. He steps into darkness and emerges inside a narrow service chamber beyond the lab wall. Vex follows instantly, proving the route connects cleanly between both spaces. Atlas tries entering next, but the shadow seam contracts around the damaged shell edges. Pain flashes through the bond before the tortoise even moves one full step. Kieran tells Atlas not to force it, because forcing things is already Apex's specialty. The tortoise backs out, frustrated, but no longer automatically sacrificing through injury. Vex studies the shell, then shifts the shadow seam around the intact front plate. First, instead of dragging Atlas through at once, the Stalker moves the opening section by section. Kieran feels the technique spreading load across separate channels, exactly like Atlas learned defending. The rescue works because Vex adapts around Atlas's damage instead of demanding normal movement. Apex spent years trying to turn defects into failures worth exploiting. Kieran's party keeps turning those same differences into instructions for cooperation instead. Atlas disappears through the wall slowly and emerges beside Kieran without fresh cracking. Vex crosses last, just before Nira reaches the containment column from behind. The shadow seam seals, leaving Apex on the wrong side of solid ancient stone. Kieran allows himself exactly one breath of relief before alarms change pitch again. The service chamber descends toward a maintenance rail that should reach the western foundations. Mara's map shows no connection, but Voidspire stopped respecting maps several rooms ago. Vex leads because the Stalker's soul sense now reads moving pathways before they stabilize visually. Atlas limps beside Kieran, shell tilted enough that one side drags against stone occasionally. Each scrape feels like a warning that escape alone will not solve the damage. Behind them, Nira reroutes security through the labyrinth instead of chasing physically. Walls shift every few minutes, trying to turn the maintenance route back toward containment. Vex recognizes each change before Kieran sees it, and chooses alternate shadow seams quickly. The chase becomes a contest between one evolved beast and an entire fortress architecture. Kieran cannot help thinking Crownspire would still label Vex permanent F rank on paperwork. That joke stays internal because breathing already demands most available processing power. They reach a vertical lift shaft with the platform missing somewhere far below. The opposite maintenance door sits 20 feet away across empty darkness. Atlas cannot jump. Kieran definitely cannot jump. And Vex cannot carry both normally. The stalker studies the far doorway before turning one ear toward the wall above. A narrow shadow from a broken cable stretches across the shaft like a black thread. Vex steps onto it, even though there is nothing physical beneath his paws. The evolved beast runs along the shadow itself and reaches the opposite side effortlessly. Kieran feels the route through the soul thread, but still dislikes every part of it. Vex widens the cable's shadow until it becomes a dark bridge barely waist wide. Atlas places one claw onto the bridge and immediately sinks several inches into darkness. The stalker braces on the far side, holding the path stable through sheer core pressure. Kieran walks beside Atlas with one hand against the shell's intact edge. Halfway across, the fortress, lights flare and erase the cable shadow almost completely. The bridge begins collapsing beneath Atlas, while the void shaft waits below without enthusiasm. Vex snarls and darkens the space around his own body to replace the missing shadow. Kieran feels the evolved core strain, but not fracture under the sudden demand. Atlas lowers his body and stops moving, inducing weight shifts that destabilize the route. Kieran follows the tortoise's lead and freezes instead of panicking forward. Vex extends the darkness another foot, then another, rebuilding the bridge from soul pressure. They reach the opposite doorway seconds before the last shadow behind them disappears. Vex collapses onto his side, but remains conscious and immediately tries standing again. Kieran tells him nobody is earning speedrun points for passing out dramatically either. The stalker growls, while Atlas nudges Vex down with one broad front claw. For once, Atlas gets to protect someone without absorbing a direct enemy attack. Kieran gives Vex water and waits until the violet eye glow steadies completely. The pause costs time, but keeps the party from turning evolution into another form of abuse. Security boots echo somewhere above them, growing closer through the lift structure. They move again once Vex stands voluntarily, and Atlas can bear weight safely enough. The maintenance rail finally joins a tunnel Kieran recognizes from the western entry map. Freedom should be less than a mile ahead if Voidspire stops rearranging itself. That sentence proves too optimistic when 3 Apex handlers block the next junction. Each handler carries compact weapons instead of controlled beasts. After Vex's collar disruption, the lead man fires a resonance net toward Atlas before Kieran can change direction. Vex crosses the wall shadow and intercepts the net's anchor line from the side. The stalker bites through the cable, then disappears before the electrical pulse returns. Kieran throws a broken maintenance bolt at the second handler's visor and keeps moving. Atlas angles his intact front plate, redirecting a stun round into the corridor wall. The technique is weaker with the shell compromise, but still perfectly recognizable. Vex attacks the lights instead of the guards, dropping the junction into complete darkness. For Apex, darkness becomes a liability now that the shadow hair has evolved inside it. Kieran senses Vex moving around hostile soul signatures like water around rocks. One weapon disappears, then another, without any direct strike on exposed throats or joints. The stalker is choosing disabling attacks because Kieran never demanded a kill path. That restraint matters when one handler drops his gun and backs away voluntarily. Kieran leaves him conscious, which surprises the man more than violence probably would. The remaining guards retreat toward brighter corridors and activate emergency barriers behind them. Vex finds a floor shadow beneath the first barrier and opens a narrow crossing route. Atlas cannot fit without lowering the damaged shell, so Kieran removes a support brace first. The tortoise crosses slowly, while the stalker holds the passage open from both sides. Somehow, every successful obstacle makes Vex's new form feel less like a power-up and more adaptation. The evolution expanded exactly what the hair already trusted most: shadow and soul perception. Nothing about it restored the damaged eye, and Vex never seems to want that anymore. They reach the western drainage level as an explosion shakes dust from the ceiling. Kieran feels Ember's soul thread flare bright from somewhere outside the fortress. The surface team has apparently stopped waiting for subtle extraction signals completely. Another explosion follows, accompanied by the unmistakable roar of a furious magma wyvern. Rowan's scheduled disobedience has officially begun, several hours ahead of deadline. Kieran cannot decide whether to be grateful or extremely annoyed until later. The western security gate ahead folds inward under heat from the opposite side. Molten light cuts through steel, creating a line large enough to reveal rain outside. Ember's horned head appears through the opening, and the entire tunnel fills with relief. The magma wyvern sees Atlas first and makes a sound too low to be called a chirp anymore. Atlas answers with a weak metallic rumble and tries standing straighter despite everything. Vex emerges from shadow beside Ember, showing the evolved body without any introduction. The wyvern freezes, sniffs once, then bumps Vex hard enough to move him sideways. Vex retaliates by climbing onto Ember's shoulder like the size difference means nothing. Kieran laughs once because the team recognizing each other makes the rescue suddenly real. Rowan appears behind Ember with soot across his face and zero patience remaining. He asks why every mission with Kieran ends inside collapsing illegal research facilities. Kieran says this is only the second example, which technically makes the dataset weak. Lena cuts through the remaining gate supports while Mason rushes directly toward Atlas. The healer sees the shell and immediately stops making any reassuring facial expressions. That reaction scares Kieran more than anything Mason could have said aloud. Mason stabilizes the exposed metallic tissue with temporary resonant sealant from Ward's kit. He warns everyone not to let Atlas absorb another impact during extraction. Rowan says the request would be easier if Apex were currently respecting medical advice. Gunfire flashes through the upper tunnel as reinforcements reach the breached security level. Lena's wind kite throws a compressed gust backward, buying seconds without direct engagement. Ember turns toward the attackers, but Kieran sends a stop and cover impulse through their bond. The wyvern heats the tunnel walls instead, creating a curtain of steam from rainwater. Visibility collapses for Apex while Vex maps the party through soul signatures effortlessly. The combination feels completely broken against enemies who depend on cameras and sightlines. Rowan orders everyone toward the surface wagons before Voidspire seals the breach again. Mason and Kieran support Atlas from opposite sides without letting the shell twist. Vex scouts ahead through darkness, while Ember guards behind without overusing the unstable core. That formation is slower than escape should be, but every companion reaches the ruins together. Fresh rain hits Kieran's face when they finally clear the western drainage trench. For the first time since the ambush, no stone ceiling separates Atlas from open sky. The tortoise stops beside the trench and looks back toward Voidspire's buried towers. Kieran feels fear, exhaustion, and one surprising thread of relief from Atlas. He survived another place where someone measured his worth by structural usefulness alone. This time, the team came back for him before that judgment became the ending. The moment lasts until Voidspire's eastern ridge suddenly lights with black-violet energy. Apex activates a fortress-wide barrier, sealing every known surface entrance behind them. Rowan says that looks less like pursuit and more like destroying evidence internally. Kieran realizes hundreds of captive beasts may still be inside when the barrier closes. Vex turns toward the fortress, body rigid, clearly sensing those soul signatures too. Kieran wants to go back despite Atlas barely standing and Vex just finishing evolution. Mara's voice reaches Rowan through a delayed radio burst from outside the suppression zone. She orders immediate withdrawal because Crownspire response teams are finally mobilizing legally. Kieran hates leaving captives behind, but another solo raid would help nobody trapped inside. He memorizes the barrier frequency on Rowan's reader before the signal disappears completely. Project Hollow God is still inside, along with every creature feeding that black core. Rescuing Atlas changed the mission, but it did not end what Apex started there. The surface team retreats north through flooded gullies before search parties spread outward. Ember walks beside Atlas, deliberately matching the tortoise's painful, shortened pace. Vex moves ahead in bursts, testing the evolved form without exhausting himself again. Kieran notices the stalker avoids reflective puddles whenever lightning flashes across them. Evolution changed Vex's capabilities, but did not erase what the laboratory taught his body. That detail matters because power does not magically delete trauma from any companion. When a distant metallic clang echoes from the ruins, Vex flinches and stops moving. Kieran waits beside him until the ears rise again, without offering another command. Atlas nudges Vex forward gently with the intact edge of his front plate. The stalker starts walking, and the whole team continues at the same slower speed. They reach Rowan's hidden wagons near dawn, with guild riders approaching from the west. Mara is among them, wearing field armor instead of her usual academy coat. She sees Atlas's shell first, then Vex's new form, and forgets her prepared questions. Ward climbs from the second wagon and immediately starts swearing at everyone professionally. His eyes stay on Vex for 3 seconds before Atlas's condition steals all attention. The group transfers the tortoise onto a suspended treatment platform designed for shell injuries. Even that frame cannot fully support the new fracture spreading through Atlas's center. Ward asks what Apex did, and Kieran explains the forced channel synchronization tests. The old researcher goes silent after hearing which shell pathways were targeted. That silence follows them all the way back toward Vareth. Before anyone understands why, the return trip becomes quieter as daylight exposes how badly everyone is running on fumes. Ember sleeps standing beside Atlas's treatment platform because no wagon stall fits comfortably. Vex curls beneath the platform, new shadow fibers drifting whenever the wheels hit bumps. Kieran stays awake between them until Ward physically takes the notebook from his hands. Ward says exhaustion will not become another heroic personality trait under his supervision. Kieran asks whether that policy can be enforced without a registered contract mark. Ward says a wooden spoon requires no soul resonance and ends the debate. By noon, the convoy reaches Vareth's eastern medical district under guild escort. Mara redirects them away from Voidspire and into Ward's independent research clinic instead. She does not trust the Academy board with Vex's evolved form or Atlas's condition yet. After Voidspire, Kieran finds that decision extremely easy to support. Atlas enters the largest treatment bay on a reinforced lift with 4 technicians guiding movement. Every technician announces contact before touching shell braces, copying Kieran's clinic rule from Ember. The tortoise remains tense, but never retreats into the old automatic defensive posture. Ward begins imaging the shell while Mason monitors pain and internal metallic bleeding. Kieran stands close enough for Atlas to see him without blocking anyone's work. Vex sits in the darkest corner and watches every machine with the healthy eye closed. The Stalker is using soul sense inside normal rooms now, testing what changed after evolution. Ember remains outside the bay because his heat interferes with several diagnostic instruments. The Wyvern hates that explanation and stations himself directly beside the viewing window. Rowan claims the entire party has developed impressive talent for ignoring normal waiting areas. Nobody answers because the first shell scan appears on Ward's central display. The fracture pattern looks worse than any image taken after Ashwood. Apex forced resonance through channels that once let Atlas distribute pressure across separate plates. Several pathways have fused into scarred metal, while others no longer conduct safely at all. Ward repeats the scan twice because the first result feels impossible to accept. Mason asks the question Kieran has been avoiding since they left Voidspire. Can Atlas's shell still support a standard evolution pathway after this damage? Ward takes too long answering, which gives everyone the answer before he speaks. Most steel tortoise evolutions rebuild armor by extending one continuous resonance lattice outward. Atlas no longer has a continuous lattice anywhere across the central shell. The old fracture was survivable because separate channels adapted around the broken center. Apex tried forcing those channels together and burned the bridges between them instead. Ward says normal shell evolution now has nowhere stable to begin the reconstruction process. Kieran asks whether another material, environment, or resonance treatment could create a workaround. Ward says maybe someday, but no known steel tortoise pathway matches this architecture anymore. Mason asks for the clinical version without researcher optimism softening the edges. Ward looks at Atlas, then at Kieran, and finally says the words plainly. Under every documented evolutionary model, Atlas can never evolve again. The treatment bay goes silent except for the slow clicking of cooling diagnostic plates. Atlas lowers his head until the chin touches the reinforced platform. Kieran feels the soul thread contract inward around a familiar fear. Immediately, the emotion crossing Atlas's thread is not physical pain this time. It is worthlessness, old and familiar. From the clinic memory, the same emotion Atlas carried while waiting for the previous owner outside a clinic door. Kieran steps beside the platform and places one hand against the intact front plate. He does not tell Atlas the doctors are wrong because nobody actually knows that yet. He does not promise a miracle evolution simply because the moment hurts. Instead, Kieran says, Atlas is still Atlas before any shell becomes stronger or weaker. The tortoise saved lives before Kieran knew him and protected the party after rejection. Evolution was never the price of staying beside everyone who chose him. Atlas keeps his head lowered, but the soul thread stops tightening around shame. Vex leaves the dark corner and approaches the treatment platform without using shadow movement. The stalker presses his forehead against Atlas's exposed front claw for several seconds. Ember rumbles from behind the window, adding a warm pulse through the distant lattice. For once, nobody tries turning the emotional moment into a strategy meeting immediately. Ward gives Atlas a temporary shell frame designed to redistribute weight externally. The brace looks ugly, heavy, and nothing like an evolution upgrade. Atlas still stands more evenly once the frame locks around the surviving plates. That practical improvement earns the first faint spark of relief through the bond. Kieran writes one line in his notebook before Ward steals it again. Broken pathway does not mean broken companion, even when every scanner says otherwise. Across the room, Vex's diagnostic session creates an entirely different kind of confusion. Voidspire instruments still identify the core signature as unstable before displaying unreadable errors. Ward uses manual measurements instead of trusting anything built around normal rank classifications. Vex's evolved body stores shadow pressure more efficiently and leaks dramatically less energy. The healthy eye now functions mainly for close detail, not navigation through combat space. The damaged eye remains blind to ordinary images, but reacts strongly to living soul pressure. Ward says Apex accidentally trained a sensory pathway no standard tamer program could reproduce. Kieran corrects him gently. Apex created damage, but Vex built the adaptation himself. Ward accepts the distinction and rewrites the note before continuing the examination. The stalker can now cross disconnected shadows without the severe exhaustion seen before. Evolution. More strangely, Vex briefly disrupts forced resonance structures whenever he passes through their shadows. That explains how control chains failed during the escape from Vessel Lab 4. Mara calls the effect a nightmare for anyone relying on compulsion-based contracts. Rowan says that makes Vex the raid party's first genuine anti-cheat system. Vex flicks one ear like the title meets acceptable minimum respect standards. Kieran names the evolved form Void Shade Stalker for records until better classification exists. Ward asks whether naming unknown evolutions has somehow become Kieran's unpaid side job. Kieran says the academy refused to hire him, so the career path developed naturally. The jokes help, but every person still looks toward Atlas between conversations. One companion evolved by returning to the place that broke him. Another lost the evolutionary future he had only begun believing might exist. The contrast makes their victory feel painfully incomplete instead of clean. Mara spends the afternoon copying Vex's recovered Apex records into protected physical archives. The files prove the shadow hair was not wild when Voidspire found him. They also prove Apex operated Voidspire years before anyone officially linked them there. Several subject numbers inside the records correspond to beasts listed as missing across Vareth. Kieran asks whether authorities can raid the fortress now that the evidence exists. Mara says Voidspire's barrier collapsed every legal approach within minutes after their escape. Apex evacuated personnel, destroyed surface tunnels, and moved whatever could be moved quickly. Guild teams recovered empty cages, burned records, and several abandoned control devices. They found no captive beasts in the accessible upper levels by the time entry opened. Kieran feels sick because Apex had enough warning to relocate an entire hidden population. Vex's ears flatten when Mara mentions the missing subjects, but he does not retreat. The stalker stays beside Kieran and listens until the report ends completely. That alone proves the evolution changed more than combat output or shadow range. Vex can face information about Voidspire without being swallowed entirely by the old fear. The fear remains, but it no longer chooses every direction for him. Kieran realizes trust did not erase trauma. It gave Vex somewhere to stand against it. That lesson feels important enough to write down even without understanding why. Yet, Ward asks only one question about Vex's evolution. Did the hair choose every step himself? Kieran says yes, including the moments when running would have been safer. Mara finds one ancient fragment describing evolution after a companion reclaims an instinct suppressed by trauma. Nobody calls it a law after only 2 cases. Then Ward opens the newest Voidspire logs and finds something more urgent. Before the raid, Hollow God's test signals collapsed almost immediately. After Nira uploaded the rescue data, the collapse window stretched. Not enough to make the prototype stable. Enough to let incompatible channels survive beside each other longer. One timestamp matches Vex pulling Kieran through shadow. Another matches Atlas resisting forced synchronization. The raid did not solve Hollow God, but it taught Apex how to keep the failure alive. The victory now carries a price none of them can measure yet. Rowan says blaming themselves would be convenient for the people who built the trap. Kieran still cannot ignore that Apex designed the entire infiltration around predicting his choices. Nira knew he would follow Atlas, trust Vex, and reveal the bond under pressure. She treated compassion as a mechanic that could be farmed for research data. That realization bothers Kieran more than any insult Voidspire ever threw at him. He asks Mara whether soul bonds can be hidden or severed from outside observation. Mara says no surviving text explains enough to answer either question safely. Ward says shutting the bond down might hurt companions more than preventing information leaks. Kieran refuses to experiment with that idea simply because Apex made privacy difficult. The answer remains what it has been since Ember's cage: choice before control. They will protect the network without turning it into another prison themselves. By sunset, Ward's clinic finally becomes quiet enough to hear the cooling plates tick. Atlas sleeps with his head resting against the edge of Kieran's chair. Vex curls beneath the same chair, new shadow fibers drifting in the dim light. Ember lies across the doorway with his molten tail reduced to a low orange glow. The formation looks almost like their old apartment after Voidspire. Only none of them fit the old version of themselves anymore. Kieran looks at the three companions and remembers the permanent F-rank labels. Ember already broke his. Vex broke another inside the place that once broke him. Atlas's label feels different. Nobody is promising him an evolution now. For the first time, Kieran has to protect a companion without expecting progression as the reward. That thought exposes something uncomfortable. After Ember evolved, part of Kieran began hoping all three would eventually follow. The hope came from love. Love can still become pressure when it starts sounding like destiny. Atlas does not owe anyone a stronger form, because Ember and Vex found theirs. Kieran writes the sentence slowly, then he crosses out the word stronger. Atlas does not owe anyone another form at all. The next goal is not evolution. It is helping Atlas live without destroying himself for other people. If another path exists someday, Atlas can decide whether it matters. The soul thread warms faintly from the sleeping tortoise. Kieran closes the notebook. For once, the room feels safe enough to stop moving. It does not. Far from Voidspire, Nira watches the raid footage inside a moving Apex command room. She skips the explosions. She skips Kieran, reaching Atlas. She stops on Vex. The frame freezes as the evolved stalker leaves one shadow and enters another with no physical connection. An analyst calls it impossible phase adaptation. Nira corrects only the name, not subject V7. Vex. She deletes the old label from the live model. Another screen displays Atlas's fracture map. A third holds Ember's Ashheart activation timing. A fourth records the soul thread feedback. Kieran produced under pressure. Nira orders all 4 datasets layered together. A simulation of one enormous body appears. Its internal channels immediately begin tearing against each other. Then Atlas's fracture pattern separates the loads. Vex's phase data moves pressure between the gaps. Ember's timing model prevents every pathway from activating at once. Kieran's bond feedback sits over the system like a rhythm it cannot create alone. The simulation still fails. It simply fails slower. That is enough to change the room. Nira opens the sealed convergence protocol. A hidden camera feed replaces the simulation. Rows of essence cylinders surround a single body submerged in black fluid. Every cylinder carries a different primordial lineage. None of the essences belong together. Separate cables feed them into the same vessel anyway. An analyst says the subject remains below safe activation stability. Nira uploads the final Voidspire packet. The number rises, then rises again. No one speaks. Black fluid ripples around the central silhouette. One massive hand presses against the glass from inside. The technicians reach for sedation. Nira tells them to stop. If the vessel can make a choice, she wants to know what it chooses. At Ward's clinic, Kieran wakes before any alarm crystal reacts. Ember raises his head at the same instant. Vex opens the healthy eye, while the clouded eye turns toward the distant dark. Atlas lifts his head despite the medication. All 3 soul threads tighten around Kieran's wrist together. The sensation is not pain. It is not memory. It is not an emotion from any companion he knows. Something outside the party has touched the edge of their network. Back in the hidden chamber, the silhouette stops, pushing against the glass. One eye opens beneath the black fluid. Then several more. At the clinic, one foreign feeling crosses the outer edge of Kieran's soul. Lattice. Hunger. Then something on the far side of the soul lattice pulls back.